Hunting boots are a critical component of any successful hunt. Whether walking a short distance to your blind or trudging miles through rugged terrain, your feet are carrying the load. Without the right boots, you could give up early and lose out on that trophy just over the ridge. At Midway USA, we make selecting boots for your next hunt easier. With just a few clicks of a mouse, you can decide on what's important, like waterproofing, insulation, size, width, and savings. For just about everything for shooting, hunting, and the outdoors, check out MidwayUSA.com.
Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. So this is episode 251, and it's being sandwiched in between two kind of unusual podcasts in the sense that last week I had guests on, and next week I'm going to be doing a super late introduction. And I'll talk more about what that looks like next week. You'll actually see what it is next week. But today we're back to our normal schedule, and that means a time for me to interact with listener questions and reader feedback. So 3 great bits of information that I get to talk about today, and they come from a diverse range of sources, and actually probably the most diverse range of sources I've ever had. One is a Facebook comment. Don't do a lot on Facebook, but it's there. A YouTube comment. Don't do a lot on YouTube, although this particular video is closing in on 10,000 views, which for someone who doesn't do a whole lot of YouTubing, that's pretty decent. And then third one is a face-to-face interaction. I'm not sure I'll deal with them in that order, but those are the 3 places that I am interacting with questions, comments, and just conversations. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or an accusation, which actually one of these is a legitimate accusation, so that's kind of exciting, then always reach out. Matthew at castingacross.com. Matthew at castingacross.com. I always say this, but even if your question, your comment, your statement, whatever it might be, doesn't make it onto this podcast, every 10 episodes I do something like this, then I'll still get back to you in one way, shape, or form. So without further ado, let's dive in with the first question that was posed on YouTube. So I had a video that came out 3 years ago called How to Choose a Wading Boot for Fly Fishing. How to choose a wading boot for fly fishing. If you want to see my YouTube channel, you want to see me and the various stages my facial hair takes over the course of the year, you can go to YouTube and just put in Casting Across. I am the first one that pops up. There's not a lot of videos, but this one has gotten a lot of traction, no pun intended, because it has to do with choosing a wading boot, particularly the heavy-duty wading boots, kind of the lightweight wading boots, and then shoes. And I walk through kind of the pros and cons of each choice, and it's hopefully been very helpful to all the folks that have watched it. But recently, I received a question on it, and it's from Dave. At least his handle is Dave some stuff after that. And he says, I definitely need the Corker style, which in this video is like a really heavy-duty boot that I talked about. I think the Dark Horse is the boot that I reviewed in this video, or I use as an example. It says, I definitely need the Corker style, but I have a really wide foot, 5 or 6E. That is a really wide foot, Dave. Do you know a brand that makes a wide wading boot? Okay, so this is a great question, and my quick response to him is, I don't have a wide foot, so I've never really investigated. But then I did some investigating. And there are not any brands that pop up right away that offer the same kind of diversity of widths that you would find if you were to go to a shoe store and go to the New Balance aisle, for example, and look for a running shoe and find different widths in that. So you're not going to have, your size 10 and then your multiplicity of widths. Usually what you find, and this is something that you're not going to really know until you go and try it for yourself, is that some boots are cut differently than others. So for example, the widest toe box. Now, I know that doesn't answer Dave's question, but simply for the sake of example, the widest toe box that I have encountered in all the wading boots I've owned, at least in recent memory, is in the Redington boot. And Redington is, not maybe the first name you think of when you think of waders and wading boots, but I actually really like my waders and my boots that I have from Redington. And when their newest series of boots and waders was being designed, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, a couple years before the pandemic, actually sat down and talked with one of the folks that designed these boots, and they talked about how they designed the footbed and the structure of this boot to mimic their favorite hiking shoes, which gave them a lot of room across their forefoot and their toes, because as you step, your toes spread out, and that actually helps with stability and comfort over the course of the day. I thought that's fantastic. And I picked up a pair of the lightweight wading boots that they have, the benchmark boots actually, from that series. So what I don't do, and maybe I should do this, is I don't go on try out all the different the wading boots that come out. So if I go to a fly fishing show or I go to a fly shop, I will pick up rods. I will, wiggle rods around. I will take reels. I'll spin them. I might pop them apart, look at the guts. I will pick up a pair of wading boots, but what I rarely do, and this might be a beneficial thing, not only for myself as a consumer, but also for Casting Across, is maybe try on wading boots. Because what you will find is some are cut more generously than others. I know traditionally that folks that have bigger feet have gone with Chota and with Corkers. Those are two of the brands that I just know folks that have had bigger feet that they have really liked. I don't know if that has to do with the fact that these brands are reasonably priced and at the same time built very rugged and durable, or if this is because they are cut for a more generous foot. But you're gonna have to try them on, and you're gonna have to see what works for you. And it's not just gonna be necessarily the length and width of your foot, but it's also kind of like Dave mentioned. He wants something that's gonna offer a lot more support, but also what kind of sock you're going to be wearing. Is this going to be a 3-season boot or a 4-season boot? All of those things are worth taking into account. And that is even something where if you have a normal sized foot or a proportionate foot for the majority of the population, don't mean to disenfranchise or marginalize anybody there. But if you have a proportionate foot that is kind of your normal foot profile, if you want a bigger sock, that is going to impact the width of the boot that you choose also. So these are things to take into account, but go to a good fly shop that has a multiplicity of brands, and you can try on lots of different things. Look around, see what other stores have different wading boot options. You're going to find these at hunting stores because duck hunters are going to be wearing these boots also. Look at marine shops, because sometimes you'll find that even if they are a different sole or something like that, marine shops may have boots made by these manufacturers. Give them a shot. And is it worth spending an extra $50 or $100 to find something that is comfortable and is going to offer you the support you need? Absolutely. So in my category of things to not cheap out on, it's fly fishing boots, it's fly line, and it's sunglasses. I would rather have a less expensive, a lower quality fly rod and have good wading boots, good fly line, and good sunglasses. So, Dave, thanks for your question. Hopefully you're well on your way to finding something that fits. I did give Dave a suggestion. I did say because of that wide toe box, go to the Redington boots and look at their highest N1, because that's going to give you a lot more support than the benchmark boot that I use for kind of like my quick fishing and my fast fishing. So that was Dave's very good question. So next question, comment was actually a time at Dunk's where I hung out with David. So David lives incredibly close to me, and he kind of put some clues together based upon what I talk about on the podcast and on the website about how I live and fish on the North Shore of Massachusetts and the New Hampshire border. And he says, I live and fish in that same area too. And so he reached out and we got coffee a couple of weeks back. It was great. It was a lot of fun. I've done that a few times before with folks who listen to Casting Across podcasts as well as read the website, and I always enjoy it. And it's just a lot of fun to kind of add that aspect to what I do. And we talked about a bunch of different things, talked about where he's fishing, how he's fishing, a lot of that sort of stuff. And he had a really good question about nymphing for trout in the ponds around here. So a lot of these ponds are interesting. Ponds in this part of Massachusetts, we actually have what they call kettle ponds, and they're just really deep in the middle. So they're not super easy to fish, particularly if you're using traditional gear. If you're using a floating fly line and a 9-foot or a 10-foot leader, they're not super easy to fish when it comes to nymphing or even fishing streamers. I mean, if you have trout rising, then you're golden. But the fish that are going to be hanging out in these ponds that persist into the summer, even the late spring, they're not necessarily going to be rising all the time. So your best bet is going to be fishing for them with streamers. But there's a couple of problems with this. First of all, if they are really deep, then you're not going to just cast out and let that line sink. It's going to be really difficult to detect strikes. And there's a good chance that you're going to get hung up if you're fishing, even if you're fishing from a kayak, but certainly if you're fishing from the shore. The other option is to fish with some sort of strike indicator or a dry fly in a hopper dropper kind of rig. But now you have to have an incredibly long leader, which becomes unwieldy to cast. And with all the streamside shrubs and grasses, that becomes difficult to deal with. So what we talked through is a really good approach for fishing these deeper ponds, or even just a moderately, maybe like even a 6 or 8 foot depth shoreline where you have trout that are cruising, where you want to fish nymphs. And it takes a few different steps. And this is kind of the formula that we arrived at as kind of being my favorite and something that David wanted to give a shot. It's using a poly leader. So that's that 4 to 6 foot sink tip section that you attach by a loop-to-loop system on the front of your floating fly line. So you're using your normal 5-weight, your normal 6-weight. You put this on there, and then using a normal knotless tapered leader or some knotless tapered leader style formula that you have used of a 9-foot leader, and then putting a weighted nymph on there, but a larger nymph. So we're not talking about a midge. We're not talking about some sort of tiny little bug. We're talking about a weighted nymph of decent size. So think like a tungsten pheasant tail, or even something that looks like a hellgrammite. So you can use a woolly bugger, but you're really fishing as a nymph, because what you're doing is you're casting out, you're allowing that sink tip to get you down to where you are at a good depth. And the nice thing about being in this part of Massachusetts is that there's plenty of resources. The same is true across the border in New Hampshire. The same is true in a lot of places I've fished in Virginia and Pennsylvania, where there's maps that show what you're dealing with. So although you can't call up the state or the Commonwealth and say, hey, I got hung up and I lost my leader because your map said it was 8 feet, but it was really only 5 feet, and there was a tree there and I lost my map, or I lost my leader. You do get a kind of a good idea of what's below if you can't see down into the tannin stained water. So casting down, just using experience and trial and error, figuring out how long it takes your poly leader to drag your leader and your fly down to that depth, and then slow strips. And the slow strips need to be at a pace that's not too fast, that's going to jerk that fly out from in front of the face of that fish. But what it'll also do is it'll keep that poly leader kind of dragging at that same depth, so that that fly is moving consistently across the water column where you identify that fish are going to be. What that does is a few things. One is it's going to keep you from getting hung up. Secondly, it keeps you active. Sometimes this is not the most effective way to fish, or in the sense that it's not super productive. But if you're targeting trout late season, as you move from the spring into the summer or into early fall, they're not going to be keying in a lot on moving up into the shallows. So this keeps you active. And then thirdly, it's going to allow you to make contact with your fly and make contact with the fish. So there's a couple other auxiliary benefits to this. First of all, you're going to have bass and panfish that are going after these nymphs like crazy too. And in fact, that's one of the fun reasons to fish this way, is that it is a total mixed bag. Especially up here, we have all sorts of different species. The same is true as you move down south and move out into the west. But using a poly leader, allowing your nymph to drop down to the water column, and then slowly stripping so that you're keeping that leader and fly at a consistent horizontal plane moving across the water column, and you're having that patience as you're fishing it is a great way to get into trout into these deeper ponds. So I'm excited to hear about how David makes out as he does this. I've implemented this in my fishing in the last few years, and I find it be very productive for not just for trout in this time of year, but other times of year as well. And once again, if you're in the area, then let me know. Matthew at castingacross.com. We will see if we can get together. All right. Third comment. This one just came actually just yesterday. So I recently wrote an article, and I'll mention this at the end of the podcast, about headlamps. And when I write kind of like how to buy something, I try to give general advice. I try to say, these are the things that I look for in a product. And then what I usually do is I usually say, and here's an example of that. I had an example of a headlamp that I was going to share, and I ended up not doing it because it was on sale, and it kind of changed the price point. But then I thought, you know what, I should have put that in there. And somebody basically called me out on that. That you gave all this good advice, but you didn't give a product recommendation. Here's what Gary says. Gary says, always enjoy your articles, but that one was pretty useless without the suggested headlamp included. Ouch. Useless. Anyway, I get it. And it was an accident. I should have had it on there. I had the link all ready to go. I didn't put it in. I had a link to a black diamond headlamp that is great because it checks all the boxes of the kind of the requirements that I think a good fishing headlamp should have. And I just neglected to put it in there because I was messing with some of the price options and things like that. So Gary called me out on that, and I put it in there. So real quick, and I've no problem with that. I have thick skin, and I'm able to take criticism, and I usually do add recommendations. So real quick, there are two things I want to mention as it relates to this issue. First one is Black Diamond makes phenomenal headlamps. Actually have their higher end one coming in the mail sometime in the next week that I have for hunting purposes. I'll use it for anything and everything. I'll use it for car repair, and I'll use it for fly fishing, and I'll use it for camping, and I'll use it for when the power goes out. But it's primarily going to be my early morning hunting light. And the things that I talk about in the article are something that you should go there and check out. They're the four things that I think are worth considering as you try on a headlamp. And a headlamp is a great thing when it comes for safety as well as for function when you are out on the water. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention. Secondly, when I do these articles, my intention is not for you to have a gear load that matches mine. There's no official casting across gear checklist that I say this is really what you ought to be using. So kind of like I said with the wading boots earlier in the podcast, find something that fits your foot and fits your need. It might be a brand I've never laid eyes on, and I don't suppose that anybody is assuming that that's what I'm trying to do. But what I have tried to do over the last 8 years of casting across is share from my experience as a consumer and as my experience in the fly fishing world, selling this stuff and writing about this stuff, kind of some of the things that I find are the most essential aspects of a particular piece of gear based on normal usage. So it's funny, again, I appreciate Gary pointing out that I, submitted this article before I did my final proofread and remembered to include the link. But I've actually gotten criticism because I have suggested particular products. I thought of one article as I was thinking back through the annals of casting across, where I simply used loon floatant products to illustrate the different kinds of floatant products that are out there. So the different kinds of things that you could get. I just used all loon products because, one, that's what I had on hand, and secondly, because I wanted to kind of be consistent and not have to say, well, this one kind of does the same thing as this one, but I wanted to show the distinct products. And I had a couple comments like, oh, you're just trying to sell me loon stuff. It's like, well, I do use it. It's worth using, and it is what I'm showing, but I'm showing the different types of it. So I'm not saying it's like a no-win situation, but it kind of is a no-win situation. But know this. If I show you something, or I talk about something, or I write about something, I think it's legitimately worth you considering. But my greater concern, my greater purpose on casting across is that you will take that information, you will filter it through your budget, first and foremost. Secondly, your fly fishing. And third, the way you do fly fishing, and that you will then kind of synthesize all that information and make an educated decision. If you happen to land where I land, fantastic. If you happen to do something completely different, if to a brand that is antagonistic towards the brand that I suggested, then that's fine by me also. But I just wanted to mention that because Gary's comment was a good comment. It corrected an editing error that I made, but it also got me thinking about how I do these gear recommendations and gear reviews and how that comes across. All right, 3 fantastic bits of feedback that I got to interact with this week, and I always enjoy it. So once again, Matthew at castingacross.com. Love to hear your questions, your comments, and even your accusations. I genuinely do want to hear them. This week on castingacross.com, the first article was called Disaster and Action on Beaver Creek. So this was an unfortunate situation that popped on to, everyone's radar earlier this month. Beaver Creek is a spring creek that flows just to the east of Hagerstown, Maryland, which is about an hour and a half west of D.C. And this was a creek that I hadn't fished for years and years and years. I drove over it. I drove past it to get to some of Pennsylvania's spring creeks when I was living in Virginia. But then I finally started fishing Beaver Creek back in 2016, fished it a handful of times, had a lot of nice days there, beautiful meadows and wooded areas, and then just, of course, all of the cool things that come from it being a spring creek. Lots of brown trout and some rainbow trout as well. But they had a fish kill. As of the publishing of this podcast, I don't think they've identified precisely the point source of the pollution, but there is a quarry up in the headwaters. There are a number of agricultural sites, large farms, and they've had significant rainfall. So there could be any sort of silt or pollution or anything like that that would normally be in those sites, normally be contained, that could have been washed into the stream. And interestingly enough, it really only affected the brown trout. It did a real number on the brown trout. So it seems like the rainbows have kind of been unscathed, and the state's planning on continuing to stock rainbows. But the point of this is, one, to just point out this is unfortunate and this happens. And this has happened before on some very, very famous spring creeks and very famous rivers, and they have bounced back. It's taken time. It's not been fun. It's not been something that is worth just saying, it happens. But one of the interesting things is that the Maryland, I think it's Department of Fisheries, Department of Natural Resources, whatever it might be for Maryland, they are immediately proposing a moratorium, a no more keeping of brown trout anywhere on the stream. So there was a section of stream, and there is still, that is a catch and release fly fishing only. They are now hoping to make brown trout harvesting verboten on the entire stream to allow the brown trout to wildly reproduce and come back, which is awesome. I mean, say what you will about any other facet on the periphery of this issue. The fact that fisheries management is now saying we trust the fish to do this on their own, as opposed to introducing another strain, another genetic source of fish, is progress as far as I'm concerned. It might take time, but it's doing it the right way. And this is also aided by the fact that the prime spawning areas for brown trout, that they, at least that's what they say, and from my experience, I would tend to agree based upon the places that they pointed out, were outside of the area that was damaged by this pollution and this fish kill. So all that to say, interesting story. It'll be fun to follow because I'm optimistic. I'm generally an optimistic guy, and I've seen this happen in other streams that I've fished, and it's amazing how quickly things recover. Things will never be the same, but you know what? Things aren't the same in streams that don't have massive fish kills over a 10-year cycle or a 5-year cycle. So keep an eye on this. I'm sure there'll be some story somewhere in the coming weeks as they find out more. And remember, let's channel all the energy into progress rather than anger, because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but what you can do is clean it up and learn from it. Wednesday's article that just came out was the one called The Best Fly Fishing Headlamp. And I can see now, and as I'm saying that, The Best Fly Fishing Headlamp makes it sound like I'm going to tell you what the best fly fishing headlamp is. But I tell you what your best fly fishing headlamp is by going through 4 things that you ought to look for as you pick a headlamp. And I'll give you what one of them is. One of them is comfort. So it might be inexpensive. It might have a very bright light. It might have a really long battery life. But if you don't want to wear this thing on your head, or this thing moves around as you walk or as you wade, you're not going to want to wear it. So one of the things I talk about, the first thing actually, is that you want to wear it and you want to be comfortable as you wear it, whether you are wearing it on your hair or forehead or you're wearing it on a hat. You want to make sure that you have something that you're going to want to wear and keep on your head. This week's recommendation on the podcast is Fly Fishing Maine, Local Experts on the State's Best Waters by Bob Mallard. I've reviewed a few of Mallard's books on the podcast, on the website before. He lives and fishes in Maine. He is a champion of wild trout, native trout, particularly brook trout. So our interests converge, and so I have purchased a few of his books and had some good conversations with him at some fly fishing events. But this is a relatively new volume. It came out over the winter, and what I like about it, hear me out, is how it is a short book. It is a relatively short book. It's 230 pages. Now, you could write 230 pages on fishing certain counties in Maine. But the great thing about this book is it is not overwhelming. This is a book you could read. I mean, 230 pages, it's a guidebook you could read. Also, this guidebook, the style of this guidebook put out by Stackpole is one of my favorites in recent memory. I've got a few in this series. And I think I have another one that's actually coming in the mail next couple days. But if you are planning on fishing Maine, if you already fish Maine, if you think you're an expert at fishing Maine, that this is an essential book to have on your bookshelf. Again, it's short, but it's got color photography. It's got up-to-date information, which for a state like Maine, as kind of backcountry as a lot of it is, there's been a lot of changes and regulations over the last 5 or 10 years. So if you have a guidebook from Maine from the early 2000s, then you're going to want an update. And this one will absolutely do the trick. So I'll put a link to Fly Fishing Maine, Local Experts in the State's Best Waters from Bob Mallard on this podcast show notes over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.
A life that has the stories to back it. A life to be proud of. It's a Winchester life.
Yeah, baby. 6'8" Western. Oh, mule deer, baby, right there.
Tune in every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV.